The American Exchange Bank Robbery. Part 3 of 5. Nothing more occurred, however, to justify the suspicion against Crawford until the early part of 1890, when the persistent efforts of the detectives were rewarded by an important discovery. It was then that Robert Pinkerton learned that Crawford had told a deliberate lie when examined before the bank officials in regard to his family relations in New York. He had stated that his only relative in New York was a brother, Marvin Crawford, who was then driving a streetcar on the Bleecker Street line. Now it came to the knowledge of Mr. Pinkerton that Crawford had in the city 3 married aunts and several cousins. The reason for Crawford's having concealed this fact was presently brought to light through the testimony of one of the aunts, who, having been induced to speak, not without difficulty, stated that on Sunday, May 6, 1888, 2 days after the robbery, her nephew had called at her house, and given her a package which he said contained gloves, and which he wished her to keep for him. It was about this time that the papers contained the first news of the robbery, and, her suspicions having been aroused, she picked a hole in the paper covering of the package large enough to let her see that there was money inside. Somewhat disturbed, she took the package to her husband, who opened it and found that it contained $2,000 in bank notes. Realizing the importance of this discovery, the husband told his wife that when Crawford came back to claim the package she should refer him to him, which she did. Some days later, on learning from his aunt that she had spoken to her husband about the package, Crawford became greatly excited, and told her she had made a dreadful mistake. A stormy scene followed with his uncle, in which the latter positively refused to render him the money until he was satisfied that Crawford was its rightful possessor. A few days later Crawford's young friend, the man about town, called on the uncle, and stated that the money in the package belonged to him and must be surrendered. The uncle was still obdurate, and when Crawford and his friend became violent in manner, he remarked meaningly that if they made any more trouble he would deliver the package of money to the Adams Express Company and let the company decide to whom it belonged. This brought the angry claimants to their senses, and Crawford's friend left the house and never returned. Finally, Crawford's uncle compromised the contention by giving his nephew $500 out of the $2,000, and retaining the balance himself, in payment, one must suppose, for his silence. At any rate, he kept $1,500, and also a receipt in Crawford's handwriting for the $500 paid to him. Other members of the family recalled the fact that a few days after the robbery Crawford had left in his aunt's store room a valise, which he had subsequently called for and taken away. None of them had seen the contents of the valise, but they remembered that Crawford on the second visit had remained alone in the store room for quite a time, perhaps 20 minutes, and after his departure they found there a rubber band like those used at the bank. The detectives also discovered that on 15 May, 1888, 11 days after the robbery, Crawford had rented a safety deposit box at a bank in the Fifth Avenue Hotel building, under the name of Eugene Holt. On 18 May he had exchanged this box for a larger one. During the following months he made several visits to the box, but for what purpose, was not known. On presenting this accumulated evidence to the Adams Express Company, along with his own deductions, Robert Pinkerton was not long in convincing his employers that the situation required in Central America the presence of some more adroit detective than had yet been sent there. The difficulty of the case was heightened by the fact that Crawford had established himself in British Honduras, and that the extradition treaty between the United States and England did not then, as it does now, provide for the surrender of criminals guilty of such offences as that which Crawford was believed to have committed. Crawford could be arrested, therefore, only by being gotten into another country by some clever manoeuvre. The man best capable of carrying out such a maneuver was Robert Pinkerton himself, and, accordingly, the Express Company, despite the very considerable expense involved, and fully aware that the result must be uncertain, authorized Mr. Pinkerton to go personally in pursuit of Crawford. Mr. Pinkerton arrived at Belize, the capital of British Honduras, on February 17, 1890, nearly 2 years after the date of the robbery. There he learned that Crawford's plantation was about 90 miles down the coast, a little back of Punta Gorda. Punta Gorda lies near the line separating British Honduras from Guatemala, and is not more than 100 miles from Spanish Honduras, or Honduras proper, directly across the Gulf of Honduras. Difficulties confronted Mr. Pinkerton from the very start. People were dying about him every day of yellow fever, and when he started for Punta Gorda on a little steamer, the engineer came aboard looking as yellow as saffron, and immediately began to vomit, so that he had to be taken ashore. Then the engine broke down several times on the voyage, and the heat was insufferable. As the boat steamed slowly into Punta Gorda, it passed a small steam craft loaded with bananas. "Look," said one of the passengers to Mr. Pinkerton, not aware of the nature of Mr. Pinkerton's mission, "there goes Crawford's launch now." Landing at once, the detective waited for the launch to come to shore, which it presently did. The first man to come off was Marvin Crawford, whom Mr. Pinkerton recognized from a description, although he had never seen him. Then he saw Edward Crawford step off, dressed smartly in a white helmet hat, a red sash, a fine plaited linen shirt, blue trousers, patent leather shoes, and so on. Mr. Pinkerton approached and held out his hand. "I don't remember you," said Crawford, but his face went white. "You used to know me in New York when I examined you before the bank officials," said the detective, pleasantly. Crawford smiled in a sickly way and said, "Oh, yes, I remember you now." Mr. Pinkerton explained that he had traveled 5,000 miles to talk with him about the stolen money package. Crawford expressed willingness to furnish any information he could, and invited Mr. Pinkerton to go up to his plantation, where they could talk the matter over more comfortably. Seeing that his best course was to humor Crawford, Mr. Pinkerton consented, though realizing that he thus put himself in Crawford's power. They went aboard Crawford's launch and steamed up the river, a very narrow, winding stream, arched quite over through most of its length by the thick tropical foliage, and in some parts so deep that no soundings had yet found bottom. The plantation was entirely inaccessible by land on account of impassable swamps, and the crooked course of the river made it a journey of 23 miles from Punta Gorda, although in a straight line it was only 6 miles away. Mr. Pinkerton was surprised at the unpretentious character of the house, which was built of cane and palm stalks and roofed with palm branches. Originally it had been one large room, but it was now divided by muslin sheeting into 2 rooms, one at either end, with a hall in the middle. Almost. The first thing Mr. Pinkerton noticed on entering was a fireproof safe standing in the hall. It was of medium size and seemed to be new. He knew he was powerless, under the laws of the country, to search the safe, but he made up his mind that while he was in the house he would keep his eyes as much as possible upon it. That night he did not sleep for watching. But Crawford did not go near the safe until the next morning, when he went to get out some account books. While the door was open, Mr. Pinkerton saw only a small bag of silver inside, but he felt sure from Crawford's manner that there was a larger amount of money there. Mr. Pinkerton remained at the plantation for 48 hours. On the second day he had a long interview with Crawford, questioning him in the greatest detail as to his connection with the robbery. Crawford persisted in denying that he had had any connection with it, or had any knowledge as to what had become of the stolen money. Argue as he would, Mr. Pinkerton could not beat down the stubbornness of his denials. All direct approaches failing, at last he tried indirection. He spoke of Burke, the absconding state treasurer of Louisiana, who, along with a number of other American law-breakers, had fled to Central America. Burke had a level head, hadn't he? Said he. "How do you mean?" asked Crawford. "Why, in going to Spanish Honduras. You know the United States has no extradition treaty there under which we could bring back a man who has absconded for embezzlement or grand larceny. Burke is as safe there as if he owned the whole country." "Is that so?" said Crawford, looking significantly at his brother Marvin, who was present.